As Andrew said, I am also a pastor. I work down the street at Compass Point. I've been in full-time ministry for just over 15 years now. I've worked in a couple of provinces. I did my undergrad in Saskatchewan, worked in southern Alberta, did my master's out in BC, and then came back home, actually to my old home church, Compass Point, and I've been serving there now for 6 years. And a lot of my role isn't doing this. It's not preaching most of the time. I am what most people would say is a worship pastor. I get to be in charge of our Sunday morning, we call it our Encountering God Together time, the time we get to come and to sing and to hear the word, yes, and children and hospitality and all that. And I love that. I love being able to craft and work on what it is we do when we gather together to worship. I'm also a singer-songwriter, and I love writing songs for the church. It's one of the things I'm passionate about. And in fact, right now, I am working on a Christmas album. I know it does not feel like Christmas outside. It's a little bit crazy. We actually have a Christmas tree set up in our basement that we never took down, just as a constant reminder to me and to my wife, Rachel, to help me, Dave, just keep working on this Christmas album. It's necessary. And as I've been working on songs, writing songs, and working on arrangements, one of the things that I've done is reflected on my years in ministry and what Christmas looks like. And I thought back to Rachel and my first Christmas in Lethbridge. So we're newly married. We're living thousands of kilometers away from family and most of the people we knew. And I'm working in a church, and if you don't know this, when you're a pastor at Christmas, Christmas looks a little different. A lot of people kind of are like, oh, I've got lots of family things. And I was like, I guess we're going to hang out here for Christmas because I'm working until like 10 p.m. on December 24th, which is great. It's part of the job. Loved it. So did all kinds of things. And as we're getting closer to Christmas, we decided we're just going to have a quiet Christmas at home. And someone from the church we've gotten to know, a couple kind of 10 years older than us with a couple young kids, says, hey, we'd love to have you guys over for Christmas. I think, well, that's awesome. Really appreciate that. We can go over for a Christmas meal. It'd be really nice to just kind of sit around the table with them. And they said, no. We want you to come to our house when you're done on Christmas Eve. We want you to bring your sleeping bags. And we want you to spend Christmas with us, to be a part of our family for Christmas. And I'll tell you what, there's a lot of things I remember about Christmases, about planning services, but that is probably the most significant Christmas gift I have ever received. And I realized, as we thought about that, that cost them something. We see Christmas as this time to hang out with our family, right? We protect it. It's great. It's a time to be together. And they gave that up in a way to invite us in. They sacrificed their own experience so that they could love us. And I want to talk this morning about worship and about sacrifice. I'm going to read from a passage that some of you probably know, Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I'll give you a minute to get there. This book was written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Rome, and it's a beautiful theological look at what it is to be the church and the story of God and his people. Let me read Romans 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not be conformed to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. What comes to mind for you when I say the word sacrifice? For me, I've got kind of a number of things, including like maybe the Indiana Jones movie, or maybe like Return of the Jedi when Han and Luke are tied up and they're, being put over an open fire. They're going to be sacrificed. It turns out okay, don't worry. I also have stories that I've seen. Sometimes they come up on social media. Sometimes they happen in friends' lives of people who have done tremendously generous things to help one another. I have a friend who needed a kidney, or he was going to die, and found a donor who didn't know him, didn't know anything about him, who freely gave him a kidney. That's a sacrifice. And I think we love stories of sacrifice. They're incredibly compelling. And I think they're much harder to live. We as Canadians, I think we're good at being nice, being polite. We're pretty good at being kind. Sometimes we're even generous. And I think sacrifice takes it even a little bit farther. And I think that's what we're being called to. Let's look back at this passage for a second. How does it start? It starts with the word therefore. And when we see a therefore in the Bible, we have to ask, what is it? Therefore. Right? What is it there? It's two different. What is it there for, right? So a therefore usually points back. And in the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans, Paul has been laying out the story of God and his people. And I'm going to do my best really quickly to sum all that up. I would encourage you, go and read that sometime this week. I think it starts with God gifting everything to us, creating a good world and placing people in it and saying, go and steward this. It is my gift for you to enjoy. There is abundance, there is goodness. And our reaction as people was to say, wow, there's a lot of good. I might lose it, so I better try to grab as much as I can and control it. And we find quickly that if something's good, we worry that it'll be taken away. So we try to grab it, and we get tangled up inside, and we make bad choices. We sin. We dishonor God and disobey him and his plan for the world. We try to control things by making idols or cities or things that allow us to control and to not have to trust in God. And then God continues this whole time to enter the story time and time again with his mercy and his goodness. He continues to call people to himself, to forgive them, to promise to them, the people of God, to be with them over and over and over and over until it culminates in the person of Jesus, God's Son sent to earth to live a perfect life, to die a death he does not deserve so that he would pay the price for our sins, so that we could be put in right relationship with God. This is the story. This is the therefore. And we see this as an opportunity. Paul is saying, this is the story. We respond to the story. When I was doing my undergrad at a place called Briarcrest, I was studying music and theology and worship. And we talked a lot about how to define worship. And it's one of these words that we use to mean a lot of different things. When we talk about worship music, usually we're talking about a pretty specific style of music that we sing together. And I think there's something incredibly important and significant about this, a worship gathering, a time to sing, to pray, to hear God's word. But I think the Bible also defines worship in a much broader sense. And I had a professor who wouldn't let this go because we were constantly learning how to best lead worship, how to lead the music, how to plan services. And he reminded us constantly to come back to this passage and that sacrifice was more important than singing. I think singing is great. I think it's really important. I mean, I have dedicated my life to leading people in singing, to writing songs, to retelling the story of the gospel. But I still think sacrifice is the thing that we often need to be reminded of. In Isaiah 29, verse 13, there's a haunting passage where God says, These people come near me with their mouth. They honor me with their lips. They sing well. But their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is based on merely human rules that they have been taught. So I think we need to wrestle with what it is to worship as sacrifice, what it is to enter in and to honor God. Why is there this therefore? When we think about sacrifice, we think about both a noun, a thing, right? We sang about the lion and the lamb this morning, and we think about the lamb of sacrifice, or we think about Jesus being a sacrifice on a cross. We think about it in a way that relates to death, and I think that's good. In Leviticus, everyone's favorite book of the Bible, right? The Leviticus talks about 5 different kinds of sacrifice that the people of God were given. And we think most of them, I used to think most of them were related to me becoming right with God, or the people becoming right with God, right? You're going to forgive me, I'm going to spill blood, that will make things right. Really interesting, when you read about these 5 types of sacrifice, 2 are related to atonement, 2 are kind of legal, and the others are really different. There's one that's kind of just like, hey, come to the temple, bring a feast, bring your friends, be in my presence. And the Hebrew word for sacrifice actually means, here's how you can come near. It's an invitation. And I think if we only think of sacrifice as a legal term, as being made right, we miss out on the relationship. I think practically we're all afraid to die and to lose things, right? I mean, death is, you talk about what people are most afraid of, public speaking, and death. And in my job, again, as a worship pastor, I spend a lot of time at funerals. I've been to a lot of funerals. I've been to funerals of really important, really wealthy people, and I've been to funerals of really lowly people. And the interesting thing after a while is that funerals aren't that different. In fact, the things that we build in our lives and the ways that we find worth and value often mean very little at a funeral. When children of the deceased come near and they talk about memories from home, what is it to be in relationship? What is it to actually have things? I think we try to hold things to us. I actually think the heart of idolatry is control. I think the way that we're called to worship God is to give him control. And I think we live in a world where we're surrounded by things that give us the illusion of control. And we attempt to grab those things and hold them tight. And I think we're being given a choice here in this passage. There's 2 ways you can lose everything you've got, because it's going to happen. 1, you can watch it slip through your fingers as you try desperately to hold it tighter. Or 2, you can open your hands and give it up, like Jesus did. We live in a world with amazing technology, right? We've got houses, cars, we've got nice clothes, we've got toys, we've got these things that give us these impressions of being in control, of having power. And I think being called to be living sacrifices isn't to renounce all of those things and to say, I can't have any of it. It's to hold all of it with open hands. I think death is part of it, right? There's this death of sacrifice, this noun where we see things die, we give them up. But we're being called to be living sacrifices. And I think we're called to live sacrificially. I think sacrifice can also be a verb, an action word, a way that we choose to live. Eugene Peterson, in his paraphrase of the Bible called The Message, writes this of this passage. Take your everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, you're eating, you're going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Take your everyday life. When I was growing up in the church, and in a similar church to this, kind of a great evangelical church, I at times wondered if all that mattered was my soul. I think the emphasis on Jesus saving me was really good and really needed. But I at times wondered, what does this have to do with my life? What does this have to do with the things I interact with, or the way that I eat food, or my friends that I want to hang out with, or my career, my job? And I don't think the Bible calls us to ignore the physical realities. We're not Gnostics. We're not dualistic. Those are early church heresies that said all that matters is your soul. Our bodies don't matter at all. I think we know that our bodies will die. I think we know that the things around us can become idols, and that's hugely problematic. But the interesting thing about idols, if we remember the story, is that they are good gifts to be put in their right place under God. I think we're called to live in a reordered world, one that doesn't see these things as primary, as the things we turn to, the things that give us power and control, but still sees them as good and gifts. I think there are two definitions that we see of the good life. And I think if you think about this and ask yourself, what is it I define the good life as? This is a question that drives a lot of who we are and what we do. I think you can kind of see it in people around us. And some writers talk about worldview, some talk about the Greek term telos. It's the definition of the good life. Where is your life pointing to? What do you think is good? I think a lot of our world right now, a lot of the culture that we're steeped in says, collect more. Make sure that you're in control, that you're safe, that you've got the privacy that you want, that you can treat yourself when you need to. I think these are the patterns of the world that Paul calls us not to conform to. And I think the other definition of the good life is this sacrifice, following in Jesus' example and living it out daily. Practically, I think we all get hints of this sacrifice, and we've all seen it, but we struggle to do it. I think anyone who has been in a family, which is most of us, and we've all had different family experiences, some better than others, but I think we understand that being in a family requires sacrifice. Parenting requires sacrifice, right? You can't always do the things that you want. You often choose to do the things that's best for another person. You give of your preferences, you give of yourself to make space, to serve, to teach. I think that's really good. I think sacrifice is incredibly important and key in our mission to the world, to go and to make disciples. Acts tells us, the book of Acts, that the early church, when they came together after Pentecost, they sold their things and they shared. They lived in community and they met each other's needs. And that's a scary passage, right? Can you imagine being asked or even being prompted to sell what you've got to serve those that are sitting beside you this morning? It seems kind of crazy. When we moved out to BC, so we'd been working in Lethbridge, Alberta for 7 years, and I resigned at the church. Just felt like God was calling us into a new season. I was going to go do a master's. 2 young kids, I am unemployed, moving to one of the most expensive cities in the world. Really great idea. Solid move. And I did this, I resigned, without having any idea where we were going to live. So it's something I was praying about, but I was like, well, I'm probably going to go into crushing debt and rent an apartment that's this big in Vancouver. It's going to work well. And then my mom came to me and she said, hey, I used to work with someone who now lives in Calgary, whose sister, I think, lives somewhere out there. You should call them. And I was like, Mom, that's the definition of a stranger. Like, you've taught me better than this. But I thought, can it really hurt? So I sent an email. And this lovely couple, whose kids had recently moved out, who lived on a 5-acre estate in the country that you could see the ocean from, and had a 1,000-square-foot, fully furnished, beautifully renovated guest house, said to us, we've been praying about a way to use this to bless someone. Rent is really cheap. And it was incredible. It was this like hand of God moment in our lives. But I know that was a sacrifice for them. They could have chosen, and you know, if their financial advisor would have said, hey, rent it out. You can get way more money. Or keep it empty. It's a great place to have like friends and family come stay. Like you can use it for whatever you want. Instead, they chose to gift it to us. And it was this incredible example of sacrifice. If you look at the rise of Christianity in the Roman world after the time of Jesus, it's fascinating. You went from this ragtag group of a couple hundred disciples of Jesus, following what the Roman world says was a cult, right? This little group, and they're kind of like, it doesn't really matter, to being the dominant religion in a couple hundred years. And the question is why? And the historians have looked into this, have actually pointed to the plague as the reason why. So when the plague hit the Roman world, I mean, they didn't know what we know today, but the Roman citizens figured out pretty quickly, if I stick around, I'm going to get sick and I might die. So they all took off. The church, followers of Jesus, said, we're sticking around to care for people. And many of them died. But many of them, and we understand immunology now, became immune. And they loved people who, by all standards, lived in a world where their lives weren't worth anything. And there were people around them saying, you are worth my potential death so that I can love you. And when the Roman world rebuilt after the plague, almost everyone who survived had a personal relationship with someone who had lived sacrificially in the way of Jesus, by being present, by serving them. I love this idea of the church as a winsome community, as a community that sacrifices to compel people and invite people in. And I think sacrifice is so important in our churches, in our local churches. What does it look like for us to live sacrificially together? And one of the things we do is we give of our gifts, right? We've already seen this morning, there are people greeting. The friendliest person here is a greeter. That's a good use of gifts, right? We've got great musicians on stage. We've got people serving and helping the tech stuff to go well and helping us all engage well. People are using their gifts and giving of their time and their energy. I think that's beautiful. And I think we step into those needs. Like 60 of you volunteered yesterday for a food drive. Well done. That is such a great witness of the church. I think part of worship is our sacrifice when we give financially. And money is a hard thing to talk about in churches, usually because the people having to talk about it work for the church. But I don't work for you, so this is great. I can talk about this a little bit. I say this not to guilt, not to pressure, but because I actually think one of the best ways to get to know who Jesus is to live this way, is to step in and to give sacrificially. Some of you might know who Tim Keller is. He's a fantastic theologian who recently passed away. Brilliant pastor who taught so many other pastors and modeled this beautiful, vibrant urban ministry in New York City. He has one of my favorite sermons on giving and what it is to give. And one of the questions we ask when it comes to giving is, should I tithe, right? The rule in the Old Testament was give 10%. And it's not repeated in the same way in the New Testament. So we kind of say, well, how much should I give to my church? Right? And there's various answers. And Tim Keller's answer was, give sacrificially. Because that's what the Bible is full of examples of. We're called to step in, and we know, again, if you know the story of Jesus well, you know there's a story where he goes to the temple and he watches people put bags of money in the offering. And then he watches a poor widow come up and put 2 coins in. And he says, truly I tell you, she has given more. I don't think any financial advisor would tell that woman to go and to give that money. And I'm not saying we're called to be unwise with our money, but I am saying I think the call of Jesus on my life is to give sacrificially. I think it's easy to give from the stuff that's beyond our hands, right? We can grasp a lot of stuff, but we've got a lot of stuff in our world. So there's stuff that's out there that I can't quite fit in, and I can give that away. I'm being generous. Isn't that wonderful? No, I'm called to live like this, with open hands. To give until I feel it. To give in a way that stops me from doing the things that I want to do all the time. I think that's what it's called to sacrifice. And then I think actually this might be the hardest one, and maybe I'm just saying that because I'm a worship pastor, but I think we give sacrificially of our preferences in the church. We give of our preferences. Now, as a worship pastor, I know a lot about people's preferences. And I love, my master's is in theology and arts. I love thinking through spaces and visuals and things. I think there is something about the ways we use aesthetics, the songs we sing, the rooms we're in, the colors, the sound, all of that. I think that is compelling. My wife has a degree in urban social geography, and we regularly note the change in society from having big front porches to front garages and 6-foot privacy fences, right? The aesthetic decisions around us make a difference. They're not ultimate things. One's not right or wrong, but they encourage us in different ways. So I think these things matter. And I think the church is unique and at times I think possibly crazy for the way that we say we can gather together 5 generations and we can engage in something together. Where else does that happen? Right? Where else do you go with people who you have nothing in common with except your recognition that something's broken inside and you need the help of Jesus? And that's what we are at the church. And it's wonderful, but it leads to tension, right? Some of us would rather sing hymns or new songs or old songs or this or that. Some of us want the coffee to be this or that. Some of us would rather have seats. Some of us think we need the pews. You know, there are so many preferences. And I think that's good. I think God has designed each of us to care about things and to connect deeply with things and to have a heart language. And that's great. But I think the call of being in the church and living in the way of Jesus is to give of our preferences. And if you're hearing this right now and thinking, yes, someone's finally saying it, those people will give of their preferences, you're doing it wrong. When was the last time you advocated for something for others in your church that would make you less comfortable? When was the last time you said, I don't like this, it doesn't speak to me, but I see the way that it's serving others? And I'm willing to do it because the gospel matters so much more than what I like. And the truth of Jesus is enough for me. When I worked in Lethbridge, we were a bigger church and we had just a great cross-section similar to this, generationally. And there was an older fellow who had worked in the trades and had some hearing damage and really found the volume of our services difficult, as I know many of our seniors do. It's the way our hearing works, it breaks down. It can be really challenging when something hurts physically. Instead of complaining regularly, this guy went out and bought big fluorescent orange hearing protection. And he didn't do it to make a point. He did it so he could joyfully sit in the 5th row on that side every Sunday and put his hands up in worship. Was it exactly what he wanted? Nope. Definitely not. But he gave of his preferences, and we'd regularly talk to him, and he would say, "It is so good to see the young people in church today." And I think often the call of the gospel is actually for the mature to give of their preferences for the less mature. I don't think it always means old and young, but I know in my life it means me giving up things that I want for the sake of my children. I think that's the call of the church. That's the call of worship, and to live sacrificially. I think this is the life. Sacrifice has death, right? We kill things, we stop things, but it also requires us to step in and do this daily. To keep saying, what is it that I keep trying to hold on to, and how do I live more with open hands, with my money, with my gifts, with my preferences? How do I live like Jesus? And I don't think it means living with just kind of willy-nilly doing it all the time. The back part of this passage talks about then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And I think if we look at the life of Jesus, we see a man who healed the sick, who gave of himself, who showed up, and who ultimately died on the cross, but also stepped over sick people who wanted healing. And why, right? Like, what do we do with that? Well, Jesus was so in tune with what God was calling him to. And I think one of the beautiful things about the local church is that we, in this building, are in a unique time and a place. This church looks different than the church, my church down the road that's meeting this morning. And God is calling you to something unique because of the time and the place and the people that are here. I think that's amazing. I think learning how to listen, how to embrace sacrifice in a way that meets that needs and allow God to get all of the glory of the good things, of the way that he's drawing people to himself. I think that's so important. You know, one of the things that has become a standard in our family life is inviting people over for Christmas. A couple years back, there was a young adult in our church who couldn't make it home, wasn't sure what she was going to do, so I called my parents. We were going over to their house for Christmas dinner, and I said, "Hey, we're bringing someone. Deal with it." And they were fine. They did it. But it took a little bit of boldness, and our family has loved being able to die to ourselves a little bit and the things that we want, and we have found such great joy in living sacrificially. And this is why I think it's not just death, it's also life. There's such great joy in following in the way of Jesus and sacrificing for others and seeing God at work in their lives. God takes our sacrifices and he often starts a chain reaction that we couldn't even imagine and certainly can't take credit for. I believe that we're here for a purpose, that God is calling you, calling us, calling this church into something great. He's calling us into this self-emptying love of Jesus. I don't know exactly what that looks like. Maybe it looks like more food drives like you did yesterday. Or opening your home, as a colleague of mine did, and starting to foster and engage in some really hard stuff. Or just giving of your preferences and learning from someone who's not like you. I don't know what it is, but I think we're called to step in. We're called to worship God by embracing the death and the life of sacrifice, holding all that he has given to us with open hands. It's one of the reasons why when I sing, sometimes I put my hands like this. It's a reminder to me, I think our bodies matter, and doing this or doing this is, as much as it might not be what I'm thinking, it kind of says, I'm holding stuff. it's mine. This is a physical reminder to me, God, open me to things that I need to sacrifice and give to you. Let my worship not end in this singing. Let there be a therefore after church today and into my week. Let me live in sacrifice. We're going to sing together in just a minute. And I hope our singing again reminds you of this story of the good news. And I hope it encourages you to embrace the life that Jesus is calling all of us to live like him and to sacrifice. Let me pray. Oh God, you are so good, and your gifts to us are so good. God, we thank you for the good world around us. We confess our longing to hold it to ourselves and to control things, and we turn to you and ask that you would help us open our hands and live back to you as you have lived to us in full surrender and sacrifice. God, may our worship not be empty words. May our worship be winsome sacrifice. May the community around us see us not just for what we are right about, but for the way that we serve one another because of who you are. Help us to know you more, to worship you in every corner of our lives.